Hi guys! Ever wondered what it was really like to be a prisoner in the Middle Ages? Torture chambers, unfair trials, and maybe even a desperate escape attempt. That's exactly what we're getting into today. Before we dive in, make sure to like and subscribe if you enjoy chilling historical stories. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Always cool to see viewers from every corner of the world. Now, dim the lights. Let the background hum surround you. And let's step into the dark. In Medieval Shackles, a prisoner's memoir, written in the year of our Lord 1347, in the city of Avignon, by the hand of former prisoner Guillaume de Montfort. Have you ever wondered what it feels like to wake up one morning as a free man, only to find yourself in chains by evening? I lived 40 years before I learned the answer to that question, and now, by God's mercy, as I see sunlight once more, I consider it my duty to tell you about this hell on earth that men call medieval dungeons. My name was... well, it matters not what I was called. What matters is that I was an ordinary wool merchant in Toulouse, with a house, a wife, and 2 children, until that day in September 1342, when I was accused of heresy. Chapter 1. The Arrest Picture, an autumn day in Toulouse. The air thick with the scent of ripening apples and smoke from hearth fires. You walk down a familiar street, thinking of pressing matters, the price of wool, the upcoming fair in Montpellier. Suddenly, 2 men in dark cloaks step before you. One is a Dominican, Inquisitor Brother Bernard de Caux. The other, a sergeant of the city guard. Guillaume de Montfort. The Inquisitor's voice sounds calm, almost gentle. When I nodded, suspecting nothing evil, he spoke words that made my knees buckle. In the name of the Holy Inquisition, and by the authority granted to me by Pope Clement VI, I arrest you on charges of heresy and blasphemy. Tell me, what would you have felt in that moment? I remember every second, how cold ran down my spine, how my heart seized, how it seemed the ground was slipping from beneath my feet. Arrest on charges of heresy in the 14th century meant one thing. You were entering a system from which few emerged alive. The sergeant bound my hands with coarse rope. The rope was damp and reeked of hemp oil. The first thing I felt physically was how it cut into my wrists. That sensation would never leave me for the rest of my days. They led me through the entire city to the Château Narbonnais, where the tribunal of the Holy Inquisition was housed. Citizens stepped aside, crossed themselves, averted their gazes. In their eyes, I read not sympathy, but fear. Fear of finding themselves in my place. Do you know what it means to walk through your own city as a condemned man? Every stone beneath your feet, every familiar face in the crowd, every scent from the bakeries where you once bought bread, all of it becomes alien, distant, as if you're already dead and watching your former life from beyond the grave. Chapter 2. The First Descent. The dungeons of Château Narbonnais were built in the bowels of the ancient Roman foundations. As we descended the stone steps, each step took us further from the world of light and air into something that resembled the very mouth of hell. The stench hit me first. Have you ever smelled a place where human bodies rot while still alive? It's a mixture of excrement, urine, vomit, infected wounds, and something else. The sweet, sickening odor of despair itself. It clings to your clothes, seeps into your hair, and after a few days, you realize with horror that you've become part of that stench. The walls wept with moisture. Not the clean dampness of a cellar, but something oily and foul, as if the very stones were sick. When I first touched the wall to steady myself, my hand came away covered in a greenish slime that reeked of decay. The sounds, dear God, the sounds. Even now, 5 years later, I wake at night hearing them. The constant drip, drip, drip of water somewhere in the darkness. The scraping of chains against stone. The scurrying of rats. Rats so bold they would run across your feet even while you were awake. And the voices of men who had already lost their minds, babbling prayers, curses, or simply making sounds that were no longer human. They threw me into a cell barely 6 feet square. The floor was covered with mouldy straw that squelched wetly underfoot. In one corner lay a wooden bucket that served as a latrine, though after the first week, when it overflowed, the distinction between floor and latrine became meaningless. There was no window, no light save for the dim glow that filtered down from the guard post above when someone carried a torch. Most of the time, we lived in absolute darkness. Do you know what total darkness does to a man's mind? At first, you strain your eyes, hoping to see something, anything. Then you begin to see things that aren't there. Shapes moving in the blackness, faces in the walls. After a month, you're no longer sure what's real. Chapter 3. The Companions of Misery. I was not alone in that hellhole. My cellmate was a man named Pierre, a former Cathar who had been there for 3 years. 3 years. When I first saw him in the dim torchlight, I thought I was looking at a corpse. His skin hung loose on his bones like a badly fitted sack. His hair had fallen out in patches, leaving scabrous sores on his scalp. His teeth were gone, rotted away from the foul water and spoiled food. But it was his eyes that truly frightened me. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much, endured too much. They held a kind of mad wisdom, the knowledge that comes only to those who are descended into the deepest pits of human suffering and somehow retain their sanity. Pierre taught me the rules of survival in the dungeon. First, never trust the guards. They were not merely cruel. Cruelty implies passion, emotion. These men had ground their humanity away like wheat beneath millstones until only cold efficiency remained. They would promise you anything, extra food, news of your family, even mercy, in exchange for information. But they delivered nothing except more suffering. Second, ration everything. The daily meal, such as it was, consisted of a piece of mouldy bread and a bowl of thin gruel made from rotten barley, and whatever scraps the guards chose to throw in. Sometimes there were bits of meat, but you learned not to examine them too closely. I once found what I was certain was a human finger in my bowl, though hunger made me eat it anyway. Third, keep your mind occupied. Pierre had memorized every prayer he'd ever learned, every song, every story. He would recite them to himself for hours, not aloud. Speaking without permission earned you a beating, but silently, moving his lips in the darkness. This exercise, he said, was what kept the madness at bay. The water they gave us was drawn from a well that must have been contaminated. It was brown and tasted of iron and rot. Within days of drinking it, most prisoners developed the bloody flux, a dysentery so severe that men would void their bowels 20 times a day until they wasted away to nothing. I watched dozens die this way, lying in their own filth, too weak to move, calling for their mothers with their final breaths. Chapter 4. The interrogations begin. After 2 weeks in the pit, they came for me. The guards hauled me up the stairs, and the sudden exposure to even the dim light of the interrogation chamber left me blinded and reeling. My legs, weakened by confinement, could barely support my weight. The chamber was a study in calculated intimidation. The walls were lined with instruments whose purpose was unmistakable. Iron tongs, thumbscrews, the strappado pulley hanging from the ceiling like some obscene chandelier. In the center stood a wooden table, its surface stained dark with what I knew was blood. Behind the table sat 3 men, Brother Bernard de Caux, the Dominican inquisitor who had arrested me. Beside him, a notary whose job was to record every word, every scream, every plea. And finally, the secular authority, a representative of the Count of Toulouse, there to ensure that the church's work had proper legal sanction. Brother Bernard looked at me with eyes that held no more warmth than winter stone. When he spoke, his voice carried the absolute certainty of a man who believed he was doing God's work. "Guillaume de Montfort," he began, "you stand accused of heretical pravity, of denying the authority of Holy Mother Church, and of giving comfort to enemies of the faith. How do you answer these charges?" What could I answer? I was a wool merchant. My greatest theological concern had been whether it was a sin to charge interest on loans. Yet here I sat, accused of crimes that could see me burned alive in the public square. I protested my innocence, of course. I declared my faith in Holy Mother Church, my devotion to Christ and all the saints. I begged them to examine my life, my business dealings, my charitable works. Surely these would prove I was no heretic. Brother Bernard listened to my protestations with the patience of a cat watching a mouse. When I finished, he smiled, a thin, cold expression that never reached his eyes. "Heretics always proclaim their innocence," he said. "It is the first sign of their guilt. A true Christian, when accused of heresy, would examine his conscience and confess his failings. Your denials prove that the devil has hardened your heart against the truth. Do you see the trap? Confess, and you condemn yourself. Deny, and your very denial becomes proof of guilt." This was the logic of the Inquisition, perfect in its circular reasoning, inescapable as a spider's web. They returned me to my cell without torture that day, but the message was clear. I had been given one chance to confess voluntarily. The next time, they would extract the truth by other means. Chapter 5. The question. Ordinary and extraordinary. The phrase sounds almost gentle, doesn't it? The question. In the language of the Inquisition, it meant torture, though they never used that crude word. They were, after all, men of God, seeking only truth in service of the Almighty. They came for me again after another week in the darkness. This time, they stripped me naked and chained me to the wall of a different chamber, one that smelled of fear and blood and human waste. The stones beneath my feet were worn smooth by the struggles of countless prisoners who had stood where I now stood. Brother Bernard read from a long scroll, detailing the procedures that would be followed. Everything was done according to canon law, properly recorded by the notary. The church was nothing if not meticulous in its cruelties. The question ordinary began with the strappado. They bound my hands behind my back and attached the rope to a pulley in the ceiling. Then they hoisted me up until my feet left the ground, my entire weight suspended by my shoulders. The pain was... I lack words for it. Imagine every muscle in your back and chest tearing simultaneously while fire shoots down your arms. They left me hanging for what felt like hours, though it may have been only minutes. Time has no meaning when your body screams with agony. Brother Bernard asked his questions in the same patient tone. Do you confess to heresy? Do you acknowledge your crimes against God and Church? Name your accomplices. When I continued to protest my innocence, though by now my words came out as gasps and sobs, they added weights to my feet. 20 pounds of iron dangling from my ankles, multiplying the torment beyond endurance. Still, I would not confess to crimes I had not committed. This seemed to puzzle Brother Bernard. In his experience, most men broke during the strappado. My resistance was, in his mind, further proof of diabolic influence. They lowered me to the ground, and I collapsed, my shoulders screaming with agony, my arms numb from the elbow down. I thought, hoped, that the torture was over for the day. I was wrong. Since the question ordinary has failed to open your heart to truth, Brother Bernard announced, we must proceed to the question extraordinary. The water torture. Even now, my hands shake as I write these words. They strap me to a slanted table, my head lower than my feet. They pried open my mouth and inserted a funnel. Then they began pouring water, slowly, steadily, relentlessly. Have you ever nearly drowned? The panic, the desperate need for air, the certainty that death is seconds away. Now imagine that moment stretched out for what feels like eternity. The water fills your mouth, your throat, your lungs. You cannot breathe, cannot scream, cannot even think beyond the animal terror of suffocation. And just when you're certain you will die, they stop, let you vomit up the water, and begin again. Between each application of water, Brother Bernard asked his questions. My answers, when I could speak at all, were incoherent gurgles. But somehow, through God's grace or my own stubborn foolishness, I held to my innocence. After hours of this, though again, time becomes meaningless in such circumstances, they finally stopped. I had not confessed, but neither had I died. This presented the Inquisition with a problem. Canon law forbade torture that would cause permanent injury or death. Since I had survived the question extraordinary without confessing, they could not proceed further without risking my life. But neither could they release me. A man who withstood torture without confessing was clearly in league with Satan. How else could he endure such agony? Chapter 6. The Long Wait. They returned me to my cell, but now I was a different man. My left shoulder, dislocated during the strappado, never healed properly. My right hand shook constantly from nerve damage. But the worst wounds were those you could not see. The way I would wake screaming from dreams of drowning. The terror that seized me whenever I heard running water. Pierre looked at me with something approaching respect. "You did not break," he said. It was not a question. In the twisted hierarchy of the dungeon, this gave me a certain status. Men who broke under torture, and most did, were despised even by their fellow prisoners. They had betrayed not only themselves, but everyone they named under questioning. But a man who withstood torture without confessing gained a reputation for strength, even among the guards. This reputation probably saved my life over the long months that followed. The weeks stretched into seasons as I waited for the Inquisition to decide my fate. Men arrived and disappeared from the cells around me. Some were released after confessing and performing public penance. Others were taken away in the night, and we knew they had been handed over to the secular authorities for burning. The cold was our constant companion. The dungeon stones held the chill like ice, and we had nothing but our ragged clothes for warmth. In winter, men would wake to find their cellmates frozen to death during the night. The guards would drag the bodies away and throw in a handful of fresh straw, as if that could mask the stench of death that permeated everything. I learned to hoard every scrap of warmth, the heat from another man's body pressed close in the darkness, the brief warmth of the daily bowl of gruel, even the heat generated by moving. We would exercise in our chains, doing what little we could to keep our blood flowing, our muscles from wasting away entirely. Disease was rampant, scurvy from the lack of fresh food, leaving our gums bleeding and our teeth loose. Consumption that started as a cough and ended with men spitting blood until their lungs gave out. Strange fevers that would seize a man and burn him up from within, leaving him raving about visions of angels and demons. I watched Pierre waste away from some wasting sickness that no one could name. Over months, his body consumed itself, the flesh melting away until he was nothing but skin stretched over bone. Yet his mind remained sharp until the very end. On the night he died, he gripped my hand with his skeletal fingers and whispered, "Remember us. Tell the world what they do here." Chapter 7. The Wheels of Justice. The Inquisition moved with the inexorable slowness of a glacier, but it did move. After nearly a year in the dungeon, they summoned me again, not for torture this time, but for sentencing. The courtroom was full of spectators, as heresy trials always drew crowds. I was brought in wearing the yellow cross of the condemned heretic, my chains clanking with each step. The crowd murmured and pointed, as if I were some exotic animal displayed for their amusement. Brother Bernard read the charges against me in Latin, then again in the common tongue, so that all could understand. The accusations were baroque in their complexity. I was alleged to have denied the divinity of Christ, to have participated in Cathar ceremonies, to have hidden heretical books, to have given money to enemies of the church. Not one word of it was true, but truth was not the point. The Inquisition had invested too much time and effort in my case to admit error now. They needed a confession or a conviction, and since torture had failed to produce the former, they would manufacture the latter. The evidence against me was the testimony of other prisoners, men who had been tortured until they agreed to say whatever their interrogators wanted to hear. Some I recognized, broken souls who had named names to make their own suffering stop. Others were strangers, men who had never met me, but who swore they had seen me at heretical gatherings that existed only in the fevered imaginations of the Inquisition. I was allowed to speak in my own defense, though by now my voice was a hoarse whisper. I protested my innocence once more, called upon God to witness my faithful service to His church, begged the tribunal to examine my life before these false accusations. Brother Bernard listened with the same cold patience he had shown during my torture. When I finished, he nodded to the notary, who read out the sentence that had clearly been prepared in advance. Guillaume de Montfort, the notary intoned. Having been found guilty of heretical pravity and having refused the mercy of confession, you are hereby sentenced to be relaxed to the secular arm for punishment according to the laws of the realm. Relaxed to the secular arm, another euphemism. It meant I was to be burned alive. The crowd cheered. In their eyes, I saw not hatred. Hatred would have been human, comprehensible. I saw instead a kind of religious ecstasy, the joy of the faithful witnessing the triumph of righteousness over evil. To them, my burning would be a festival, a celebration of God's justice. Chapter 8. The Shadow of the Stake. They returned me to the dungeon to await execution, but now my cell was different. No longer was I just another prisoner hoping for mercy or release. I was a dead man, awaiting only the technicalities of dispatch. The condemned were kept in separate cells, partly to prevent them from corrupting other prisoners with their despair, but mostly to prevent suicide. The church could not allow heretics to escape their fate by taking their own lives. They must face the purifying flames while still alive, that their souls might have one final chance at redemption. They chained me more securely now, with iron shackles around both ankles and wrists. The chains were short enough that I could not reach my throat or hang myself. They checked on me more frequently, shining torchlight into my cell to ensure I was still breathing. The other prisoners looked at me with a mixture of pity and awe. I had joined the ranks of the truly damned, those for whom there was no hope of reprieve. In the strange social order of the dungeon, this gave me a kind of terrible prestige. Word of my sentence had spread through Toulouse. My wife came to see me. One final visit allowed to the families of the condemned. They brought her down to the dungeon, this woman who had shared my bed for 15 years, who had borne my children, who had loved me when I was a man of substance and respect. She looked at me through the bars of my cell, and I saw in her eyes what I had become. My hair had turned white from the stress and poor nutrition. My body was skeletal, ravaged by disease and torture. My clothes hung on me like burial shrouds. She wept, but she did not speak. What was there to say? The church had declared me a heretic, and no good Christian could be seen to sympathize with such a creature. Even her tears were a kind of apostasy. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her that I died innocent of the charges against me, that she should not mourn for a heretic but remember the man she had married. But the guards allowed no words between us. She was permitted to look, nothing more. When they led her away, I knew I would never see her again. In all likelihood, she would remarry quickly. Staying connected to a condemned heretic would make her own position precarious. My children would take their stepfather's name, and in a generation, my very existence would be forgotten. This perhaps was the cruelest torture of all, not just to die, but to be erased, to have your life declared null and void by men who had never known you. Chapter 9. The Miracle of Flesh. The execution was set for the Feast of St. Michael, September 29th. A fitting date, Brother Bernard declared, as it was when the archangel cast Satan into hell. I would burn as a warning to all who might be tempted to follow the path of heresy. 3 days before the execution, as I lay in my chains contemplating the flames that awaited me, I heard unusual sounds from above, shouting, the clatter of arms, the neighing of horses. The guards abandoned their posts, rushing up the stairs toward whatever commotion was unfolding in the world above. For the first time in months, we prisoners were left alone in our darkness. In the cell next to mine, a man named Raoul, who had been condemned for witchcraft, began to laugh, a sound more terrifying than any scream. "Do you hear that, brothers?" he called out. "The English have taken the city." The English. In 1346, Edward III had launched a new campaign in France, and his armies had been sweeping through the southern provinces. Toulouse, with its divided loyalties and weakened garrison, had fallen to a surprise assault. Over the hours that followed, we heard the sounds of battle fade, replaced by the activities of an occupying army. New voices echoed in the corridors above, speaking English and Gascon rather than French. The Inquisition tribunal had fled, taking their records but leaving their prisoners behind. On the second day of the English occupation, new guards came down to the dungeons. These were not the cruel, efficient servants of the Inquisition, but common soldiers looking to make sense of what they had inherited. They stared at us with a mixture of disgust and bewilderment. An English captain eventually appeared, a practical man more concerned with the cost of feeding prisoners than with the fine points of heresy. He had us brought up into the courtyard, squinting and stumbling in the sunlight we had not seen for months. "Christ's blood," he muttered as he looked us over. "Half of you are dead already. What's the point of keeping corpses?" He questioned us briefly about our crimes. When he learned that most of us were condemned for heresy, a charge that meant little to an English Protestant soldier, he made a decision that seemed to surprise even himself. "You're free to go," he announced. "Take yourselves off before I change my mind." Just like that. After 2 years in the dungeons of the Inquisition, after torture and condemnation and the certainty of death, I was free because a foreign army had conquered my city, and a practical soldier couldn't be bothered with theological niceties. Chapter 10. The World Above. Do you know what it feels like to step into sunlight after 2 years of darkness? The light was like knives in my eyes, stabbing through to the back of my skull. I had to cover my face with my hands, peering through my fingers like a child afraid of thunder. The world above had changed during my imprisonment. The streets I remembered were scarred by battle. Many of the houses I knew were burned shells. The people who had once nodded respectfully when I passed now crossed themselves and hurried away at the sight of me. I was marked, you see, not just by the yellow cross sewn to my ragged clothes that could be removed, but by what the dungeons had done to my body and soul. I walked with a limp from the leg irons that had cut to the bone. My left hand shook constantly from nerve damage. My hair was white as snow, and my skin had the waxy pallor of the grave. But worst of all was what people saw in my eyes. I had looked into the abyss of human cruelty and seen what civilized men could do to one another in the name of God and justice. That knowledge marked me as surely as a brand, and decent people instinctively recoiled from it. My house had been confiscated by the Inquisition, sold to pay for the costs of my trial and imprisonment. My wife had indeed remarried, a prudent decision that I could not fault her for making. My children called another man father, and looked at me with the fearful curiosity reserved for strangers. I was a ghost haunting my former life, a reminder of what could befall any man who drew the wrong attention at the wrong time. In a sense, I was more dangerous free than I had ever been as a prisoner, because I could tell others what I had seen, what I had endured. The English occupation did not last long. Within months, French forces had retaken Toulouse, and with them came new inquisitors to replace those who had fled. I knew it was only a matter of time before they came for me again. After all, I had been condemned but not executed, a loose end that needed tying. I gathered what few possessions I could carry and left Toulouse forever. I became a wanderer, moving from city to city, taking whatever work I could find. never staying long enough to attract attention or form attachments that might be used against me. Chapter 11. The Brotherhood of the Branded. In my wanderings, I discovered that I was not alone. Throughout the cities and towns of Europe, there were others like me, men and women who had survived the Inquisition's dungeons, who carried the invisible marks of torture and imprisonment. We found each other by instinct, recognizing something in each other's eyes that marked us as members of a terrible brotherhood. There was Marie in Lyon, accused of witchcraft because she had the misfortune to be present when a child died of fever. She had lost 3 fingers to the thumbscrews and spoke in a whisper because they had damaged her throat during the water torture. Like me, she had confessed to nothing and somehow survived. In Geneva, I met Thomas, a former Franciscan accused of teaching heretical doctrines. The Inquisition had branded his forehead with a cross, the mark of the unrepentant heretic, before his monastery successfully petitioned for his release. He covered the scar with his hood, but in certain light, you could still see the angry red lines that would mark him until death. We shared our stories in whispers, in the shadows of taverns and the corners of markets. We had all learned the same lessons, that justice was a luxury of the powerful, that innocence was no protection against accusation, that the machinery of the church could crush any individual who got caught in its gears. But we also shared something else, a peculiar kind of strength that came from having endured the worst that men could do and somehow surviving. We had looked death in the face and walked away. We had been broken and tortured and condemned, yet here we were, still breathing, still thinking, still capable of hope. This strength came at a price. None of us could ever again live the normal lives we had once known. We were forever marked, forever suspect, forever one accusation away from returning to the dungeons we had escaped. But we were also free in a way that ordinary people could never understand. Free from the illusions that comfort most men. Free from the belief that the world is fundamentally just and reasonable. Chapter 12. The Heretic's Road. I spent 7 years on the roads of Europe, 7 years learning what it meant to be truly masterless in a world where every man was supposed to have his place in the great chain of being. I worked as a scribe when I could hide my shaking hand long enough to write clearly. I labored in fields when farmers needed extra hands and weren't too particular about a worker's past. I begged when all else failed, though beggars with the look of former heretics were rarely welcomed warmly. The roads were dangerous for anyone, but doubly so for men like me. Bandits and cutthroats were the least of our worries. We had little worth stealing. Far more dangerous were the local authorities, always suspicious of wanderers, always ready to blame the nearest stranger for any crime or misfortune that befell their communities. I was arrested twice more during those years, once in Bordeaux on suspicion of theft, once in Marseille for wandering without purpose. Itself a crime in the eyes of some magistrates. Both times, I was fortunate that local authorities were more concerned with maintaining order than with pursuing complex theological investigations. A few weeks in the local jail, a public flogging, and I was turned loose to continue my wandering. But those experiences served as constant reminders of how precarious my freedom truly was. I lived always under the sword of Damocles, knowing that any day might bring new accusations, new trials, new dungeons. I learned to sleep lightly, to keep my few possessions always ready for flight, to trust no one completely. The physical hardships of the road were nothing compared to the spiritual wasteland I inhabited. I had been raised in the faith, had accepted without question the teachings of Holy Mother Church. But how could I maintain that faith after what I had experienced? How could I believe in divine justice when I had seen the instruments of God's own representatives turn to such cruel purposes? Yet neither could I embrace the heresies I had been accused of preaching. I had seen what happened to true believers, Cathars, Waldensians, and others who genuinely challenged church doctrine. They faced their tortures and deaths with a certainty I could not share, sustained by beliefs I could not accept. I existed in a kind of theological limbo, unable to believe, yet unwilling to despair completely. Perhaps this was the truest heresy of all, not the embrace of alternative doctrines, but the simple refusal to accept any absolute truth in a world that seemed to run on nothing but arbitrary power. Chapter 13. The weight of memory. Do you know what happens to a man who has seen too much? The memories don't fade. If anything, they grow sharper with time, more vivid, more present. I could remember every detail of my torture with crystalline clarity. The sound the strappado rope made as it tightened, the taste of the water they forced down my throat, the particular expression on Brother Bernard's face as he watched me suffer. These memories invaded my sleep, turned my dreams into theatres of past agonies. I would wake screaming, my body drenched in sweat, my heart hammering as if I were still hanging from those terrible ropes. In the first years after my release, this happened nightly. Even after 7 years, it still happened often enough that I learned to seek lodgings far from other sleepers, lest my nightmares disturb them and draw unwanted attention. But the memories brought more than just personal torment. They brought responsibility. Pierre's dying words haunted me. Remember us. Tell the world what they do here. I was perhaps the only man alive who had experienced the full horror of the Inquisition's procedures and lived to speak of them. Did I not owe something to those who had died in those dungeons? Yet who would believe me? Who would want to hear such terrible truths? The Church was the foundation of civilization, the source of law and order and meaning. To challenge its methods was to challenge the very structure of society. Even those who might privately question the Inquisition's excesses would rarely speak such doubts aloud. I began to write, setting down my experiences in careful detail. But I wrote for no audience I could imagine. I certainly could not publish such an account. That would be signing my own death warrant. The manuscripts I created were hidden away, moved from place to place as I wandered, preserved more from compulsion than from any real hope that they would ever see light. Writing became a kind of penance, a way of keeping faith with the dead. Every night when I set down my experiences, I remembered not just my own sufferings, but those of every man who had shared my captivity. Pierre, wasting away from his mysterious illness. Raoul, driven mad by years of torment. The dozens of others whose names I never learned, but whose dying screams had filled my nights. Chapter 14. The Plague Years. In 1348, the Great Mortality reached the city where I wandered. You know it as the Black Death, that terrible plague that swept away 1/3 of Europe's population. For men like me, living always on the margins of society, it brought new dangers, but also strange opportunities. The dying cities needed anyone willing to tend the sick, bury the dead, maintain what order they could in the face of apocalyptic collapse. My experience of suffering, my familiarity with death, made me oddly qualified for such work. I could look at a plague victim without flinching, could handle corpses without the revulsion that paralyzed others. In Avignon, where the papal court had established itself, I found work helping to dispose of the mountains of bodies that accumulated faster than they could be properly buried. The city had become a charnel house, with death carts making their rounds every morning to collect the night's harvest of corpses. The irony was not lost on me, who had been condemned as a heretic and enemy of the church, was now serving that same church in its hour of greatest need. The priests and bishops who might once have ordered my burning now blessed my labours and paid me from church coffers. The plague was a great equalizer. Rich and poor, noble and peasant, bishop and beggar, all fell victim to the pestilence. I watched princes die in agony while criminals survived unscathed. If there was any divine justice in who lived and who perished, it followed no logic that mortal minds could comprehend. In the midst of all this death and horror, something unexpected happened. I found a kind of peace, not the peace of resolved faith or philosophical understanding, but the peace that comes from useful labour. For the first time in years, I was not running from anything or hiding from anyone. I was simply doing work that needed to be done, work that no one else was willing or able to do. The plague also brought a loosening of the social bonds that had made my life so precarious. With so many dying, with established authority breaking down everywhere, there was less energy available for pursuing old grudges or investigating the backgrounds of useful workers. I was able to move more freely to establish something approaching a normal routine. Chapter 15. The Scribe's Calling. As the worst of the plague passed and society began to reconstruct itself, I found steady employment as a scribe in Avignon. The papal bureaucracy, even in its reduced state, generated enormous quantities of documents, and literate men were always in demand. My years of wandering had actually improved my qualifications. I could write in several hands, knew Latin and the vernacular languages, and had developed the steady nerve necessary for detailed work. The irony of my position was exquisite. Here I sat, in the very heart of the church that had condemned me, copying out bulls and decrees, recording the proceedings of ecclesiastical courts, transcribing the very documents that would be used to hunt down and prosecute other heretics. I had become part of the machinery that had once tried to destroy me. But this position also gave me access to information that few laymen ever saw. I read the correspondence between inquisitors, the reports from dungeons across Europe, the careful records of tortures and confessions. What I learned in those documents was both worse and better than what I had experienced personally. Worse because I discovered that my own case was utterly routine. The procedures that had seemed so deliberately cruel were simply standard practice, applied to thousands of prisoners across the continent. The tortures that had nearly broken my mind were described in the church's own manuals with the same clinical detachment one might use to discuss agricultural techniques. Better, because I also saw evidence of growing unease within the church itself about the Inquisition's methods. Some bishops were beginning to question whether the cure had become worse than the disease, whether the pursuit of heresy was causing more harm to Christian souls than the heresies themselves. Chapter 16. The Secret Archives. My work brought me into contact with documents that officially did not exist, reports too sensitive for general circulation, correspondence between high church officials that revealed the political calculations behind theological decisions, records of cases where the Inquisition had clearly overstepped its authority. In one particularly shocking document, I found a letter from a papal legate to Pope Clement VI, describing how the Inquisition in Carcassonne had tortured a wealthy merchant's entire family, including his 12-year-old daughter, to force him to confess to heresy. The real motive, the legate noted privately, was to seize the man's properties to fund the Inquisition's operations. Another file contained testimony from guards and executioners who had grown sick of their work and sought absolution from their superiors. These men described prisoners who had confessed to impossible crimes, flying through the air, transforming into animals, attending sabbats with devils who spoke in languages that did not exist. Yet these obviously false confessions had been accepted as evidence and used to justify executions. A casual comment about increased church activity in Toulouse might reach someone there in time for them to disappear before the Inquisitors arrived. Chapter 19. The Weight of Compromise. But living this double life extracted its own toll. Every day I sat at my desk, carefully copying out orders for torture and execution, maintaining the careful bureaucratic facade that made the Inquisition's work possible. Every document I transcribed was another step in someone's journey to the dungeon or the stake. How do you measure the worth of such compromises? If my small acts of sabotage saved a dozen lives, did that justify the hundreds of documents I faithfully copied that led to other deaths? Was I a hero for the resistance I offered, or a collaborator for the cooperation I provided? The questions tormented me, especially in the small hours of the night when sleep would not come, and the faces of the dead rose before my eyes. I had become complicit in the very system that had destroyed so many others like me. I wore clean clothes now, ate regular meals, slept in a warm bed, all paid for by the institution that tortured innocents in the name of God. Yet, what was the alternative? I could have refused the position, could have returned to the roads and the precarious existence of a marked man. But then someone else would have taken my place, someone without my knowledge of the system's inner workings, someone without my motivation to offer even small resistances where possible. I told myself I was more useful inside the machine than outside it, that my compromises served a greater good. But in the darkest moments, I suspected I was simply too comfortable to give up my position, too tired of suffering to choose the harder path of open opposition. These moral complexities had no clear resolution. I was neither saint nor villain, neither hero nor coward, but something more difficult to categorize. A man trying to maintain his humanity within an inhuman system, making imperfect choices in a world that offered no perfect ones. Chapter 20. The Living and the Dead. After 3 years in Avignon, I had established as normal a life as someone with my history could hope for. I had modest lodgings in a respectable quarter, enough income to eat well and dress appropriately, even a few acquaintances who knew nothing of my past and treated me with ordinary courtesy. But normalcy was an illusion I could never quite maintain. The past lived too vividly in my memory, pressed too heavily on my conscience. I would be walking through the market, thinking about dinner or the weather, when suddenly I would see a face that reminded me of Pierre, and the dungeon darkness would flood back over me. Worse were the moments when I encountered former prisoners who had not been as fortunate as I. Avignon, as the papal seat, drew many petitioners seeking justice or mercy from the Church's highest authorities. Among them were men and women bearing the visible marks of the Inquisition's attention. Missing fingers, branded foreheads, the characteristic shuffle of those whose feet had been damaged by torture. I recognized several faces from the dungeons of Toulouse, men who had been released after confessing and performing public penance. They did not recognize me. I had been better fed and clothed in recent years, and prison had aged us all beyond recognition. But I knew them, remembered their voices crying out in the darkness, their faces twisted with pain during interrogation. Seeing them free but broken, trying to rebuild lives from the wreckage the Inquisition had made of their existence, reminded me constantly of how precarious my own position remained. I was not truly free. I was simply between imprisonments, enjoying a temporary reprieve that could end at any moment. Some of these former prisoners had found peace of a sort. They had genuinely embraced the faith of their persecutors, had convinced themselves that their sufferings were justified punishments for sins they had actually committed. It was a kind of salvation, I suppose, though one purchased at the price of their own sanity. Others remained bitter, nursing hatred for the Church that had destroyed their lives. These were dangerous to be around. Their anger made them reckless, likely to say things that would draw new accusations. But I understood their rage, felt it echoing in my own heart, even when prudence demanded I suppress it. Chapter 21. The Price of Memory. The years passed, and I grew older, more careful, more resigned to the compromises my survival required. But I never stopped writing, never ceased the compulsive recording of memories and experiences that had become my private penance. By 1353, I had filled several volumes with my testimony, not just my own experiences, but everything I had learned from other prisoners, from the secret documents I had copied, from years of observing the Inquisition's inner workings. It was a comprehensive indictment of the system, documented with the precision that only an insider could provide. But it was also my death warrant. If discovered, these writings would prove not only that I was an unrepentant heretic, but that I had been systematically sabotaging the Church's work from within. The punishment would be exemplary: public torture followed by burning, designed to serve as a warning to others who might harbour similar thoughts of resistance. I knew I should destroy the manuscripts, burn them, and try to find some peace in forgetfulness. But I could not. They were all that remained of Pierre and the others who had died in those dungeons. To destroy them would be to complete the Inquisition's work, to ensure that their sufferings were not merely unrecorded, but actively forgotten. Instead, I made arrangements for the documents to survive, even if I did not. I prepared multiple copies, distributed them to trusted associates with instructions to hide them, until some future time when they might safely be revealed. I embedded coded references in legitimate documents, created a paper trail that future researchers might follow if they knew what to look for. This was my real resistance, not the small sabotages of daily work, but this comprehensive record of institutional evil. I had no illusions that it would reform the Church or prevent future atrocities, but it would serve as evidence, as testimony that not everyone had been deceived by the Inquisition's claims of divine authority. Chapter 22. The Closing Circle. In the autumn of 1354, my careful existence began to unravel. A new inquisitor had arrived in Avignon, Brother Jean de Beaune, younger and more zealous than his predecessors. He had been tasked with reviewing old cases, ensuring that no heretics had escaped justice through administrative oversight or clerical error. My name appeared on his list. I learned of this through my network of sympathetic clerks, men who risked their own positions to provide warnings to those in danger. The investigation had begun quietly. Inquiries into my background, reviews of the circumstances of my release, questions about my activities in the years since. Brother Jean had discovered the irregularities in my case, how I had been condemned but not executed due to the English occupation, how I had simply disappeared from official records until resurging years later as a papal scribe. Such gaps demanded explanation, and explanation would inevitably lead to exposure. I had perhaps a week before the investigation reached a point where I would be summoned for questioning. Once that happened, once I was back in an interrogation chamber, facing men trained to extract truth through pain, my carefully constructed new life would collapse like a house built on sand. I could run, of course. I had done it before, had years of experience in disappearing into the anonymous masses of Europe's roads and cities. But I was older now, more tired, less resilient. The prospect of returning to that life of constant flight and fear seemed almost worse than the alternative. More importantly, running would mean abandoning the work I had been doing, both the obvious work of maintaining the church's records and the secret work of documenting its crimes. If I fled, someone else would take over my duties, and the small opportunities for resistance I had cultivated would be lost. Chapter 23. The Final Choice. On a cold November morning in 1354, I made my decision. Rather than wait for arrest, rather than flee into exile, I chose a third path. One that would serve both as personal redemption and as a final act of resistance. I requested an audience with Pope Innocent VI himself, using my position in the chancery to arrange a private meeting. I told his secretaries that I had important information about corruption within the Inquisition, evidence that required the Holy Father's personal attention. The audience was granted for December 1st. I spent the intervening weeks putting my affairs in order, ensuring that my hidden documents were secure, preparing for what I knew would be my final testimony. When I knelt before the papal throne in that magnificent chamber, surrounded by the symbols of ultimate spiritual authority, I felt a strange peace. For the first time in 12 years, I was going to tell the complete truth, without reservation or calculation, regardless of consequences. I began with my own story, the false accusations, the torture, the condemned cell, the miraculous escape. Pope Innocent listened with growing attention, occasionally asking questions that revealed both intelligence and genuine concern. He was not a monster, this Holy Father, merely a man trying to govern an institution too large and complex for any individual to fully comprehend. Then I presented my evidence. The documents I had copied, the testimonies I had recorded, the systematic analysis of the Inquisition's procedures and their human costs. I laid out the pattern of corruption, the use of heresy charges to seize property, the torture of innocents, the manufacture of evidence, the persecution of personal enemies under the guise of religious duty. Pope Innocent studied the documents with the careful attention of a trained jurist. He asked probing questions, challenged my interpretations, demanded additional evidence for the most serious charges. But he did not dismiss my accusations or order my immediate arrest. Epilogue. The Testament of Guillaume de Montfort. I write these final words in a cell in the Castel Sant'Angelo, but this imprisonment is different from my previous captivity. I am here as a protected witness, not as a condemned heretic. Pope Innocent has ordered a full investigation of the charges I have brought, and my testimony is considered too valuable to risk through premature execution. Whether this investigation will lead to meaningful reform, I cannot say. The Church is a vast institution, slow to change, protective of its prerogatives. But at least the questions are being asked, the evidence examined by men of goodwill who have the authority to act upon their findings. I may not live to see the results. I am an old man now, worn down by years of suffering and stress. But I have done what Pierre asked of me in that dark cell so long ago. I have remembered. I have borne witness. I have told the world what they did there in those dungeons beneath the churches in the name of God and salvation. The Inquisition will continue, I have no doubt. The machinery of persecution has too much momentum, serves too many interests, satisfies too many psychological needs to be easily dismantled. But perhaps it will operate with slightly more restraint, knowing that its actions are being watched and recorded by those who understand the difference between justice and vengeance. To you who read these words in some future time, when the passions of our age have cooled and perspective has been gained, I offer this testimony not as a condemnation of faith itself, but as a warning about what happens when human institutions claim divine infallibility. The moment any earthly power declares itself beyond question or criticism, the moment it begins to torture bodies to save souls, it has lost any legitimate claim to moral authority. Remember us, not just me, but all the others who suffered in those dark places. Remember Pierre, dying of wasting sickness while still protesting his innocence. Remember Marie of Lyon, who lost her fingers for the crime of being present when a child died. Remember Thomas of Geneva, branded on his forehead for asking inconvenient questions about doctrine. Remember that we were not monsters or devils, but ordinary people caught in the machinery of an institution that had forgotten the difference between power and righteousness. Remember that most of us died proclaiming our faith in God, even as his supposed servants tortured us in his name. And remember that the capacity for such evil does not reside only in the distant past or in foreign institutions, but lies dormant in every system that places ideology above humanity, that values conformity over conscience, that seeks to compel belief through fear. The darkness I have described is not unique to the medieval church or the Holy Inquisition. It can emerge wherever people surrender their individual moral judgment to institutional authority, wherever they allow their compassion to be overruled by abstract principles, wherever they forget that the test of any system is not its ideological purity, but its treatment of the powerless. In the year of our Lord 1355, I, Guillaume de Montfort, former merchant of Toulouse, survivor of the dungeons of the Inquisition, scribe in the service of Holy Mother Church, set down this final testimony with my own hand. May God, who sees all things, judge whether I have served truth faithfully in these pages. And may those who come after us build a world where no man need fear the knock at the door in the night, where no one is tortured for the crime of thinking differently, where mercy prevails over fanaticism, and where the dignity of every human soul is held sacred. Here ends the testament of Guillaume de Montfort, completed on the feast of St. Thomas Becket, December 29th, in the year of our Lord, 1355. May his memory be a blessing and a warning to all who seek justice in this world. Appendix. The language of suffering. You who have never been tortured may wonder how pain can be described, how agony can be put into words that others might understand. Let me tell you, it cannot. Language itself breaks down under the weight of such experience. But I must try, for this too is part of bearing witness. The strappado begins not with the worst pain, but with anticipation. They strip you naked, not for cruelty's sake alone, but because clothes might tear and provide some small mercy, some cushioning against the rope. The nakedness is part of the breaking, standing exposed before your tormentors, reduced to nothing but flesh and bone and fear. The rope they use is not smooth cord, but twisted hemp, coarse and thick as a man's thumb. They bind your hands behind your back so tightly that the circulation stops within minutes. Your fingers turn white, then blue, then numb entirely. This numbness is a small mercy you will later curse, for it means you cannot feel whether your hands are still attached to your wrists. When they hoist you up, the pain does not come gradually. It strikes like lightning, beginning in your shoulders and shooting down your spine in waves of fire. Your body weight, which seems so ordinary when your feet touch ground, becomes an instrument of agony. Every muscle in your back and chest screams as it tears. You hear sounds coming from your throat that you do not recognize as your own voice. But worse than the pain is the helplessness. You hang there like a piece of meat, unable to control even the most basic functions of your body. You soil yourself, vomit bile that runs down your chest, weep tears that you cannot wipe away. The humiliation is as calculated as the pain. They want to reduce you not just to confession, but to something less than human. The water torture is different. It attacks not just your body, but your mind's most primal fears. The table they strap you to is worn smooth by the struggles of countless others who have lain where you lie. The leather restraints are soft with use, darkened by the sweat and blood of those who came before. When they tip your head back and insert the funnel, you smell the metal, iron tang, mixed with the stench of fear sweat from previous victims. The water is not clean. It tastes of rust and corruption, of the cisterns where it has been stored. They pour it slowly, letting you feel each drop as it fills your mouth, your throat, your lungs. Drowning while conscious is not like drowning in a river or lake. There, you might lose consciousness quickly, find some peace in the darkness. Here, they know exactly how much water to use, how long to continue before pulling back to let you vomit and gasp and beg. They have made a science of suffocation, perfected the art of bringing you to the very edge of death and then pulling you back. The worst moment comes when you realize you will do anything, confess to any crime, betray any friend, deny any belief, just to make it stop. This is the moment they are waiting for, when your will finally breaks and you become clay in their hands. Some men reach this point quickly. Others, like myself, hold out longer through stubbornness or faith or simple inability to believe what is happening. But eventually, almost everyone breaks. I say almost because I met a few who did not. These were not necessarily the strongest or the most faithful, but often the most broken. Men whose minds had already fractured in ways that made them immune to further assault. They would hang from the strappado or choke on the water with faces of almost beatific calm, as if pain could no longer reach whatever essential part of them had retreated to some inner sanctuary. The torturers hated these men more than any others. A victim who screams and pleads confirms their power, validates their methods, but a victim who smiles while being tortured suggests that their techniques are insufficient, that they have met something stronger than pain. Such resistance drove them to ever greater extremes, though canonical law forbade torture that would cause permanent injury or death. Appendix 2. The Economics of Persecution. The Inquisition was not merely a religious institution, but an economic engine that consumed lives and property with industrial efficiency. Every arrest triggered a complex financial calculation that determined not only the prisoner's fate, but the prosperity of everyone involved in the system. When they arrested me in Toulouse, the first action was not to question my faith, but to inventory my possessions. My house, my stock of wool, my debts and credits, all were recorded with meticulous care by clerks who understood that heresy accusations were often their path to advancement and wealth. The expenses of prosecution were charged to the accused, the cost of guards who brought me to trial, the fee for the scribe who recorded my interrogation, the price of the rope used in my torture. Even the wood that would have burned my body had I been executed would have been charged to my estate. Justice, in the Inquisition's accounting, was expected to pay for itself. My confiscated property did not go to the church directly. That would have been too obvious. Instead, it was sold at far below market value to buyers who had advanced knowledge of the seizure. These buyers, often relatives or associates of Inquisition officials, would later resell at full price, sharing the profits with those who had made the arrangement possible. The guards who worked in the dungeons supplemented their official wages by selling information to prisoners' families. A few coins might buy news that a loved one was still alive. More money could secure a slightly larger portion of food or a cleaner blanket. The richest families could sometimes arrange for their imprisoned relatives to receive medicines or even writing materials. But this corruption, extensive as it was, paled beside the systematic use of heresy charges to eliminate business rivals or seize valuable properties. I witnessed dozens of cases where wealthy merchants or landowners found themselves accused of heresy shortly after refusing to sell property at below market prices to church officials or their associates. The most profitable targets were Jewish communities, who could be accused of ritual murder or host desecration with minimal evidence. An entire synagogue might be arrested simultaneously, their combined wealth sufficient to fund Inquisition operations for months. That most of these charges were fabricated mattered little. Dead heretics could not reclaim their property, and living Jews had few advocates willing to risk association with accused devil worshippers. Women accused of witchcraft provided another reliable income stream. Widows with property, but no male relatives to protect them, were especially vulnerable. The sexual nature of many witchcraft accusations allowed for particularly degrading interrogation techniques, and the supposed need to search for devil's marks on the accused women's bodies attracted paying spectators to what were ostensibly legal proceedings. The Inquisition's financial records, which I had occasion to study in my role as a scribe, reveal the scope of this enterprise. In a single year, the Toulouse tribunal processed over 300 cases, resulting in 47 executions and confiscations, totaling more than 10,000 livres, enough to build a cathedral or maintain an army in the field for months. Yet the greatest profits came not from individual cases, but from the climate of fear the Inquisition created. Wealthy families paid substantial donations to avoid scrutiny. Merchants included insurance costs in their pricing to cover potential losses to heresy accusations. Entire towns would contribute to special taxes imposed after inquisitors reported unusual levels of heretical activity in their regions. This economic dimension explained much that seemed irrational about the Inquisition's operations. Why torture continued even after confessions were obtained. Why the definition of heresy expanded to include ever more common behaviors. Why reformed heretics who had performed public penance might be rearrested years later on new charges. The system needed a constant supply of victims to sustain itself financially, and any behavior or belief could be reinterpreted as evidence of heretical corruption when economic necessity demanded. Appendix 3. The Architecture of Despair. The dungeons, where I spent 2 years, were not accidents of cruel design, but carefully planned instruments of psychological warfare. Every stone was placed with purpose, every dimension calculated to maximize the suffering of those confined within. The cell I shared with Pierre measured 6 feet by 8 feet by 7 feet high, just large enough for 2 men to lie down if they curled their bodies, just tall enough to stand upright without touching the ceiling. These proportions were not arbitrary. Too small and prisoners would die quickly from the inability to exercise. Too large, and they might find some comfort in movement. The dimensions were chosen to provide exactly enough space to survive while maximizing discomfort. The floor sloped slightly toward one corner, where a drain carried away the worst of the filth. This engineering detail prevented the accumulation of waste that might lead to rapid death from disease, while ensuring that prisoners could never escape the smell of their own degradation. The stones were fitted so precisely that no gap large enough for even a rat could be found, preventing prisoners from hiding contraband or attempting to dig their way to freedom. The walls wept constantly with a moisture that never quite dried. This was not accidental dampness, but a deliberate feature. The builders had constructed the dungeons in a natural depression and channeled groundwater through the walls in such a way that humidity remained at the maximum level compatible with human survival. This constant dampness prevented sleep, encouraged disease, and created the perfect environment for the molds and fungi that gave the dungeon its characteristic stench of decay. Light entered through a single slot, 4 inches wide and 18 inches long, positioned 7 feet above the floor. No prisoner could reach this opening, and its size was calculated to provide just enough illumination during midday to remind us that a world of light existed beyond our reach. The slot was angled so that no direct sunlight ever entered. Only the grey, filtered glow that mark the difference between day and night without providing any real visibility. The door was a masterpiece of intimidation. 3 inches of oak reinforced with iron bands, it opened outward so that prisoners could not block it from inside. The lock was visible from within the cell, a massive mechanism that clicked and clattered whenever the door was secured, a constant reminder of our captivity. The sound became so familiar that any prisoner could identify the precise moment when he was locked in or freed simply by the particular sequence of mechanical noises. But it was the sounds that truly made the dungeons unbearable. The architects had designed the corridors and chambers to amplify and channel noise in specific ways. Screams from the torture chambers echoed through every cell, magnified and distorted until they seemed to come from the walls themselves. The dripping of water created a constant rhythm that matched no natural cadence, too slow to ignore, too irregular to predict, perfectly calculated to prevent rest. Most diabolical was the system of speaking tubes built into the walls. Hidden conduits allowed guards to whisper directly into cells, creating voices that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere. Prisoners would hear their own names called in the darkness, hear the voices of their families pleading for their return, hear confessions and accusations that may or may not have been real. Many men went mad trying to distinguish between genuine sounds and these manufactured phantoms. The temperature was as carefully controlled as the humidity. In winter, the stones retained just enough cold to make sleep difficult without causing death by freezing. In summer, the lack of air circulation created a stifling heat that sapped strength and encouraged fever. The dungeons were neither the coldest nor the hottest places in the building. They were maintained at precisely the temperature that would cause maximum discomfort while preserving life. Even the rats were part of the design. Their presence was not an accident of poor construction, but a calculated element of psychological torture. The builders had created passages that allowed rodents to enter the cells, but prevented their easy escape. The rats were fed regularly by the guards, ensuring a stable population that was hungry enough to be aggressive, but not so desperate as to pose a real threat to prisoners. Their constant movement in the darkness, their occasional bites, their bold scavenging of food scraps, all contributed to the atmosphere of degradation and helplessness. The genius of this architecture was that it required no active cruelty from the guards. The building itself was the torturer, applying steady pressure to break down the will and sanity of its inhabitants. Men could be driven mad simply by the experience of existing in such a space without the need for interrogation or physical abuse. By the time prisoners were brought before their inquisitors, many had already been broken by the mere experience of confinement. Appendix 4. The varieties of human response. In my years of captivity and observation, I witnessed the full spectrum of human response to systematic brutalization. Some patterns emerged so consistently that I came to see them as reliable as the phases of the moon or the change of seasons. The first response was almost always denial. Men and women brought to the dungeons could not immediately accept the reality of their situation. They would explain to guards and fellow prisoners that a mistake had been made, that powerful friends would soon secure their release, that their accusers would be exposed as liars or madmen. This phase might last days or weeks, sustained by the simple inability of the human mind to accept that the world could change so completely overnight. Denial gave way to bargaining. Prisoners would offer increasingly desperate exchanges for their freedom: money, property, information about real or imagined heretics, sexual favors, anything that might satisfy their captors. They would confess to minor heresies in hopes of avoiding charges of major ones, or admit to crimes they had not committed if they believed such confessions would end their suffering. When bargaining failed, rage often followed. Prisoners would curse their accusers, the guards, the church, God himself. They would throw themselves against the bars of their cells, tear at their own flesh, scream denunciations of everyone who had brought them to this place. This rage rarely lasted long. It consumed too much energy, and energy was a precious commodity in the dungeons. After rage came depression so profound, it seemed to change the very substance of a man's soul. Prisoners in this stage would lie motionless for days, refusing food and water, speaking to no one. Many died during this phase, not from any specific disease, but from what seemed to be a simple loss of the will to continue breathing. The guards called it prison fever, but I recognized it as something deeper: the complete collapse of hope. But some prisoners passed through depression to reach a strange kind of acceptance. These men and women, having lost everything they thought defined them, found something essential that could not be taken away. They became the teachers and comforters of the dungeons, sharing what little they had, offering encouragement to newcomers, maintaining their humanity even in the most inhuman circumstances. A few progressed beyond acceptance to what I can only call transcendence. I saw prisoners who seemed genuinely grateful for their sufferings, who spoke of their tortures as gifts that had stripped away illusions and revealed fundamental truths about existence. Whether this was wisdom or madness, I could never determine. Perhaps the distinction ceased to matter at such extremes of experience. The most disturbing responses were those that inverted normal moral categories entirely. Some prisoners began to identify with their captors, to see the inquisitors as father figures whose approval they desperately sought. They would compete to confess more crimes, to implicate more associates, to prove their complete submission to church authority. These broken souls often became informers, betraying fellow prisoners in hopes of earning small privileges or avoiding further torture. Others developed elaborate theological justifications for their sufferings, constructing complex spiritual frameworks that made their torment not only bearable but necessary. They would preach to other prisoners about the purifying nature of pain, the blessed opportunity to share in Christ's passion, the mercy of God that allowed them to atone for sins in this world rather than the next. Perhaps strangest of all were those who found in extreme suffering a kind of dark enlightenment. They spoke of seeing through the pretenses and hypocrisies of normal society, of understanding truths about human nature that could only be learned in the depths of degradation. Some of these prisoners became eerily prophetic, predicting with uncanny accuracy which of their fellow captives would break, which would die, which would find ways to endure. What united all these responses was their ultimate inadequacy. No matter how prisoners adapted to their circumstances, no matter what mental or spiritual resources they summoned to cope with their situation, the system was designed to defeat every form of resistance. The Inquisition's greatest achievement was not the specific confessions it extracted, but the demonstration that human will, no matter how strong, could be systematically dismantled by the application of sufficient pressure over sufficient time. Yet even in the most complete victories of this system, something irreducible remained. Call it soul, call it human dignity, call it the image of God, whatever its name, it could be observed even in the most broken prisoners as a kind of inner light that torture could dim but never entirely extinguish. The recognition of this indestructible core in every human being was perhaps the most important lesson the dungeons taught, though it was a lesson their architects never intended to provide.